Imagine a time when people lived for centuries, a reality that defies our modern understanding. Have you ever wondered why biblical accounts speak of lives that lasted hundreds of years? Many believe that these biblical stories are just myths, but what if there was a hidden truth waiting to be revealed? Longevity in the Old Testament may seem like a fairy tale, but what if that longevity contained powerful biblical teachings and a secret for life today? In this video, we'll explore the fascinating mystery behind old ages in the story of the Bible and discover what it can teach us about living a full, meaningful life today. Prepare yourself for a journey that will challenge your beliefs and offer surprising revelations. Biblical stories, with their richness and depth, often leave us with more questions than answers. One of these intriguing questions is why people lived for so many years in the Old Testament. The Bible, in its divine wisdom, does not offer us a direct explanation. This leads us to reflect on ancient times and the unique conditions that could have allowed for such extraordinary longevity. When leafing through the pages of the history of the Bible, we realize that the answer lies not only in the sacred texts, but also between the lines and the historical context. In the Bible, specifically in the book of Genesis, we find reports of lives that spanned centuries, such as that of Methuselah, who lived an impressive 969 years. These biblical teachings transport us to a period before the flood, a cataclysmic event that profoundly transformed the world. Before the flood, it seemed almost normal for people to live hundreds of years. This longevity, however, gradually disappeared after this event, raising even more questions about the changes that took place on Earth and humanity. The history of the Bible leads us to consider that perhaps there are reasons beyond our modern perceptions for the longevity recorded in these texts. The absence of direct explanations challenges us to look beyond the obvious and consider hypotheses ranging from atmospheric changes to divine purposes. The journey to understand why people lived for so many years in the Old Testament is just the beginning of a broader exploration of divine mysteries and biblical teachings that still have much to teach us. When delving into the mystery of long lives in the Old Testament, one of the first hypotheses we encounter is the idea that time was counted differently at that time. It's almost as if we were trying to crack an ancient code, where days, months, and years had meanings different from ours. Biblical stories take us through this temporal labyrinth, leading us to question, could it be that, in fact, the passage of time was perceived differently? However, when we delve into historical records and biblical teachings, we realize that this theory is not easily supported. Since time immemorial, ancient people have used calendars that divided the year into approximately 360 or 365 days, based on lunar cycles and seasons. The history of the Bible, together with archaeological evidence, shows that the counting of time was much more consistent than this hypothesis suggests. Therefore, claiming that longevity was the result of a different time count seems, to say the least, unlikely. Furthermore, when considering this hypothesis, we must remember that many ancient people, not just the Hebrews, had a sophisticated understanding of time. Calendars such as those used by the Egyptians and Mesopotamians, contemporaries of the biblical patriarchs, demonstrate that humanity has always had a precise relationship with time. Thus, even when we look through the lens of biblical stories, it is clear that the counting of time was not a mere poetic device, but a solid and practical measure of the days that passed. Therefore, as we look into these ancient narratives, it is essential to recognize that the answer may not lie in the way time was counted, but rather in the living conditions of those ancient times. With each refutation, we are guided to explore new hypotheses and, perhaps, discover other facets of this fascinating mystery. Another intriguing way to explore longevity in biblical stories is the symbolic interpretation of ages. Some scholars suggest that the astronomical numbers found in the Bible do not refer to individual longevity, but rather to the duration of entire dynasties or clans. Imagine that each number is a metaphor, a representation of something bigger, something that transcends the life of a single individual. These biblical teachings invite us to look beyond the surface and consider the deep symbolism that may be embedded in these accounts. However, although this symbolic interpretation has its attraction, many defenders of biblical historicity insist on the literal validity of the ages mentioned. They argue that the stories in the Bible were written with the intention of recording accurate historical events, including the extraordinary longevity of the patriarchs. For them, the literalness of these numbers is an affirmation of faith in the accuracy of sacred texts. This dichotomy between the symbolic and the literal is a constant dance in biblical exegesis, where each side brings to light valuable aspects of interpretation. To illustrate better, think about the construction of the pyramids in Egypt, where each stone and each measurement carry meanings that go beyond mere engineering. In a similar way, the biblical ages can be seen as bricks in a larger edifice, constructing a narrative that unites history and theology. If we consider the possibility of a symbolic interpretation, it opens us to a new dimension of understanding, where each number is a door to a deeper meaning, a window into the collective soul of a people. And so, when we ponder symbolic interpretation, we leave the door ajar for other possibilities. Each hypothesis takes us deeper in the search for truth, and the story of the Bible continues to surprise us with its layers of meaning. As we explore the mysteries of longevity in biblical stories, we come across a fascinating theory that suggests that Earth's natural conditions were quite different before the flood. Imagine a world where the atmosphere was so rich and protective that it allowed people to live for hundreds of years. These biblical teachings lead us to ponder a time when nature itself seemed to conspire in favor of a long and healthy life. The suggestion that a layer of water surrounded the Earth, creating an ideal environment, opens up a range of intriguing possibilities. This hypothesis invites us to imagine a pre-flood Earth, where the climate was perfectly balanced and atmospheric conditions offered unique protection against the rigors of time. It is as if we lived under a dome of natural benevolence, where life flourished in ways we can only dream of today. The story of the Bible offers us clues about this golden age, suggesting that the flood not only transformed the physical landscape of the planet, but also drastically altered living conditions. To make this idea more tangible, think about today's tropical forests, where biodiversity is incredibly rich and climate conditions are relatively stable. Now extend that stability across the globe, creating an environment where human longevity was the norm. This view of the Earth before the flood helps us understand why the people in the biblical stories lived so long. It is a window into a lost world, where harmony with nature was an everyday reality. As we delve deeper into this exploration, we realize that natural conditions before the flood are not just a theory, but a key to understanding the biblical narrative of longevity. Each hypothesis takes us closer to the truth, and the biblical stories continue to reveal their secrets to us. With that in mind, let's now consider another hypothesis, the genetic purity of humanity's first generations, which may also have contributed to these incredibly long lives. The journey through biblical stories leads us to consider the genetic purity of humanity's first generations as a possible explanation for their extraordinary longevity. Imagine a time when humans were closer to their original creation, with a genetic code free of the imperfections and diseases that shorten our lives today. These biblical teachings suggest that the proximity of these first generations to the divine act of creation resulted in longer and healthier lives. When reflecting on this hypothesis, we can visualize a world where diseases were practically non-existent and health was a constant. Think about how, even today, some people seem to inherit a robust physical constitution, passing unscathed through illnesses that affect others more severely. Multiply this robustness by generations of genetic purity, and we have a clearer picture of what it was like to live in the times described in the Bible. The story of the Bible gives us a glimpse of this ideal world, where the purity of the human genetic code was one of the pillars of longevity. To make this more concrete, consider modern advances in genetic medicine, where scientists work to eliminate inherited diseases. If in our time we have already glimpsed the possibility of longer lives through genetic manipulation, imagine the impact of an almost perfect genetic code, free from harmful mutations. The first generations mentioned in the Bible lived in a state of health and vigor that today we can only aspire to achieve. This hypothesis of genetic purity leads us to further appreciate the complexity of the biblical narratives and the teachings they contain. Each hypothesis offers us a piece of the puzzle, and the biblical stories become a fertile field for our curiosity and investigation. When we examine the biblical stories with a critical eye, we find that longevity is not an exclusive theme of the Bible. Ancient documents, such as the Sumerian king list, also mention extraordinarily long lives. These historical records provide fascinating background that aligns with biblical teachings, suggesting that the idea of extreme longevity was a common belief in several ancient cultures. The story of the Bible, then, is part of a broader context of reports of longevity that span different civilizations. In addition to biblical texts, modern science offers an interesting perspective on how climate change may have influenced longevity. Studies indicate that the Earth's climate has undergone several transformations over the millennia, affecting the health and lives of human beings. If we consider the possibility of a more stable and benign climate in pre-flood eras, we can imagine an environment conducive to longevity. These biblical teachings take on a new dimension when placed alongside scientific discoveries about ancient climate. To illustrate this, think about ideal living conditions in regions where people currently live longer, such as certain areas of Japan or Italy. In these regions, environmental, dietary, and cultural factors contribute to greater life expectancy. Transposing this idea into the biblical context, it is plausible that a globally favorable environment before the flood could allow for remarkable longevity. The story of the Bible, with its rich descriptions of long life, can then be seen as a reflection of unique and unrepeatable conditions in the history of humanity. As we gather this historical and scientific evidence, our understanding of biblical stories deepens. Each new piece of information helps us build a more complete and complex picture of life in biblical times. And as we explore this evidence, we get closer to the essence of biblical teachings, which continue to inspire and educate generations. With this in mind, let us now consider the theological purpose behind longevity in the Old Testament, which can offer even more insights into these fascinating narratives. And when reflecting on biblical stories, a hypothesis emerges that goes beyond natural or genetic conditions. Theological purpose. Many believe that God allowed people to live many years to ensure the development and preservation of human knowledge. These biblical teachings indicate that in early times, longevity was a divine gift, allowing the men and women of that era to pass on their knowledge and wisdom to future generations. The history of the Bible is full of examples where wisdom accumulated over long lives was passed on, shaping the history of humanity. The transmission of knowledge in those times took place mainly through oral tradition, as writing was not yet widely used. Imagine living in a time where stories, laws, and teachings were passed by word of mouth from generation to generation. Longevity allowed the wisest to share their experiences directly with their descendants, creating a continuous legacy of knowledge. These biblical teachings reveal how oral tradition was crucial to the preservation of faith and cultural values before the invention of writing. As time passed and divine purposes were fulfilled, people's longevity began to gradually decrease. The story of the Bible shows us that, after the flood, living conditions changed significantly and human life expectancy began to align more with the standards we know today. This gradual decline reflects a new stage in human history, where the transmission of knowledge began to depend more on writing than on oral tradition. It is as if each age has its own method of preserving and sharing wisdom, adapting to changing conditions and divine purposes. This theological perspective offers us a deep and inspiring insight into biblical stories. Each longevity story is not just a historical curiosity, but a fundamental piece of a greater divine plan. By understanding the theological purpose behind these long lives, we come closer to biblical teachings and the wisdom they contain. As we follow the biblical stories, we notice a clear pattern. Human life expectancy decreased dramatically after the flood. The cataclysmic event marked a significant change in living conditions on Earth, reflected in biblical narratives. Before the flood, living hundreds of years was common, but as times progressed, this extraordinary longevity became a thing of the past. This transition, captured in biblical teachings, reveals to us a new era in the history of the Bible, where human life adjusted to a new normal. Abraham, one of the most important patriarchs in biblical stories, lived 175 years, an impressive longevity by modern standards, but already significantly reduced compared to his predecessors. This progressive decline continues with Moses, who recorded in Psalm 90 that human life has stabilized at around 70 to 80 years. This observation of Moses not only documents the change, but also reflects an acceptance of the new reality of human life. The history of the Bible shows us that even in the face of these changes, biblical teachings continued to guide and inspire the people. This gradual reduction in life expectancy can be seen as a reflection of new post-flood environmental and social conditions. As humanity adapted to a different world, the years of life adjusted to these new realities. Think about the evolution of modern societies, where medical advances and better living conditions increase longevity. Likewise, biblical stories show us how changing living conditions impacted longevity over time, adjusting to the needs and challenges of each era. By understanding this transition in life expectancy, we come closer to biblical teachings and the lessons they offer us. The story of the Bible is a living testimony to the human capacity for adaptation and resilience. As we explore these narratives, we realize that each era brings its own challenges and opportunities to learn and grow. Let us then end this journey by considering the final implications of the ages recorded by Moses and what they tell us about the historical fidelity of the biblical texts. When we reach final considerations about longevity in biblical stories, it is important to remember that Moses, the great lawgiver and prophet, was the one who wrote both the book of Genesis and Psalm 90. These texts not only narrate ancient events, but also reflect the perception of time and life during the era of Moses. The biblical teachings he left us suggest a continuity in the way of counting the years, confirming the integrity and consistency of the historical records of the Bible. When Moses records the long lives of the patriarchs in Genesis, he does so with the same precision with which he notes life expectancy in his own time, in Psalm 90. This leads us to conclude that Moses viewed these ages not as mere allegories, but as concrete historical facts. The history of the Bible, then, becomes a testimony to an era in which longevity was a reality, documented with the same historical rigor that we use to record our own history. This detail strengthens the credibility of the biblical texts and the confidence we can have in their records. The consistency between Genesis and Psalm 90 provides us with a comprehensive view of the evolution of human longevity. At the same time that the Bible documents lives that span centuries, it also shows us the more recent reality of Moses, where life expectancy was already approaching what we know today. This transition is not just a historical curiosity, but a reflection of the profound changes in human life over time. Biblical teachings remind us that, regardless of the era, each generation carries with it the wisdom and lessons of the previous generations. Therefore, at the end of this exploration, we understand that Moses recorded the biblical ages with the intention of preserving the history and teachings of his people. Each story, each issue, carries with it the mark of historical fidelity and reverence for past traditions. The story of the Bible thus becomes a compendium of lives lived with purpose and meaning, offering us valuable insights into human nature and the relationship with the divine. And now, after diving together into the depths of biblical stories and their mysteries, I want to know from you, what do you think about the idea of people in biblical times having lived so many years? Were these incredibly long lives real, or is there a deeper meaning behind these narratives? Biblical teachings offer us so much to contemplate, and each perspective sheds new light on the story of the Bible. Share your opinion in the comments, participate in this fascinating discussion, and help us further unravel these ancient enigmas. If you're interested in having a Bible like the one we use in our studies, check out the link in the first pinned comment. If you enjoy our content and can support our channel, consider buying us a coffee through Buy Me a Coffee. Additionally, if you can purchase a crucifix, we also have a link in the first pinned comment. We greatly appreciate your support. God bless, and see you in the next video.